I'll now deal with the three parts and touch on the main points that I've raised in my speech. First, interstate conflicts. The point I make in my speech is that of advocating amicable settlement of disputes with particular reference to third-party dispute settlement. I think it is in line with what Prime Minister Najib said about moderation, because when countries agree to settle disputes through third-party dispute settlement or other amicable ways, they are in fact showing moderation, making sure that a festering problem is resolved amicably without upsetting the tenor of the overall bilateral relations and being able to go ahead with other areas of cooperation. In this regard, I think the region in Southeast Asia has shown some very good examples. Malaysia and Singapore resolved their Pedra Branca dispute through reference to the International Court of Justice. They had a land reclamation dispute which was resolved through partly arbitration under Chapter 7 of the UNCLOS and also through adjudication by the International Tribunal of the Law of the Sea. And Malaysia and Indonesia also resolved their territorial disputes on Sipadan and Ligitan through the International Court of Justice. Now, regardless of what views one may have as to who got what in the outcome of the dispute, the key thing is they resolved the disputes through third-party dispute settlement. Now, we have to recognize that these methods of third-party dispute settlement may not be applicable in all kinds of disputes, particularly territorial disputes. For example, the intractable disputes in the South China Sea or between China and Japan or Japan and Korea. There are many reasons for that. For example, some of these disputes may get embroiled with local politics, may be so sensitive and emotional in the national psyche that governments find it very difficult to be seen to compromise even an inch of the territory. But even then, it is in the interest of the regional stability and security to ensure that these disputes do not get out of hand, or lead to tensions or to conflict. And here, I think there are positive developments within the region. For example, ASEAN and China have agreed on a declaration on the conduct of parties and also agreed on implementation guidelines. And more recently, they have embarked on a discussion of a code of conduct for handling of such disputes. Other than that, we also have to bear in mind that there is another alternative which I've advocated, and that is where such territorial disputes are not amenable for third-party dispute settlement, one alternative is that of joint exploration of the resources. And indeed, several Southeast Asian countries and some North Asian countries have either agreed on schemes of joint exploration or have begun negotiations for schemes of joint exploration. Now let me move on to ASEAN's other roles. And in particular, I want to talk about the role of the good officers of the ASEAN Chair, which is one of the modalities referred to in the ASEAN Charter. You remember last year, there were difficulties between Cambodia and Thailand concerning the Preah Vihear temple. Now, when it was referred to the Security Council essentially looked to ASEAN to have a role in this. And last year, the Indonesian chair, particularly Foreign Minister Marty, undertook shuttle diplomacy to Cambodia and Thailand, paving the way for an informal ASEAN Foreign Ministers retreat, and that itself laid the groundwork for President Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono to convene a trilateral meeting with Thailand and Cambodia on the sidelines of the ASEAN Summit. I think it's a good example of ASEAN's role in such kinds of peaceful resolution of disputes. Let me not also forget that ASEAN's role in the ARF over the years in helping to discuss in closed doors sensitive issues is also an important factor. And recently, ASEAN and ARF have been discussing how to move from confidence-building phase to preventive diplomacy. I should add another positive development in ASEAN is the dispute settlement mechanisms within ASEAN. And the most recent development was in the ASEAN Charter, which was adopted recently, there are provisions for dispute settlement mechanism. And I have a vested interest in that because with colleagues like Tun Musa Hitam, who was chairman of the ASEAN EPG, and colleagues like late Pa Ali Alatas, and I was a member of the EPG. The EPGs, in fact, recommended that the Charter should have dispute settlement mechanisms, and I'm glad that it has found its way into the ASEAN Charter. Moving on to intrastate conflicts. Briefly, let me say that the Peace Research Institute made a study of disputes since 1945, and of the thousands of disputes, they estimate that some 87% of the disputes were internal conflicts. So we have to pay attention to internal conflicts. And in my speech, I say that the traditional methods of resolution of disputes for interstate conflicts may not always be appropriate, and we may need to look at new and creative ways. And one example I cite is the way the Aceh dispute was resolved. Due to the tireless efforts of former President of Finland, Martti Ahtisaari, and the Conflict Management Institute in brokering peace talks with the Free Aceh movement and the Indonesian government, which led to a resolution of a dispute which had been plagued the country since the 1970s. But this would not have been possible if not for the enlightened approach of President Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, who showed political courage in resolving the issue. Moving to the final part of my speech, which deals with disputes, not disputes, but situations within a country where extremist or mischievous elements stoke up race, language, or religion to cause simmering issues which, if not managed carefully, can lead to tensions or worse, conflict. How to manage these issues? And in my paper, I say that it has to be a total societal effort. It cannot be left to governments alone. Of course, governments have a role to play. Governments have to nip the problem in the bud through enactment of legislation, non-discriminatory enforcement of the legislation. The government has a role to play in promoting values which prescribe and frown upon such mischievous extremist attitudes. But apart from governments, the communities concerned, the leaders of the communities have to take a stand. They have to take a stand robustly in denouncing such mischievous and extremist views. Other than communities and community leaders, individuals, non-governmental organizations, and the media all have a role to play. And this becomes more important in the age of the internet and cyberspace, where all of us know that distortions of fact, mischievous portrayal on the YouTube can go viral and can have very serious damage in stoking up feelings of hatred, enmity between race, language, and religious groups. So a total societal effort is needed with all the sectors of society robustly speaking up. And in other words, to echo the words of Prime Minister Najib in his opening speech, you need to take a stand and to give a firm, resounding no. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Jayakumar, for that very excellent delivery. I now invite Judge Christopher to make his address. Thank you.
Well, I feel honored and privileged to be able to speak about such an important subject before such a distinguished audience. Now, when we speak of conflict resolution, I think it is very important for us to think in terms of resolving, not merely of resolving the conflict after it arises, but find out what are the causes of the conflict and prevent the conflict before it arises. Because in medicine, likewise, we have curative medicine, where after the disease has struck, you try to cure it. But there is also preventive medicine. We try to prevent the disease striking the person, and that achieves much more positive results than looking into the problem after it has arisen. Now, one of the mistakes we make on the international scene is we try to resolve the dispute after it arises and do not think of the causes why it arises. And I'm reminded in this regard, I happened to be in New York on 9/11. I was due to give some lectures at New York University. I arrived there the previous day, and the following morning, sometime later in the morning, the janitor came and told me there has been a terrible incident, and he took me to the window, and I could see the blazing building from where we were. Now, I was due to give a staff seminar at 1 o'clock, so I went to the dean and said, there's no purpose in having this staff seminar, let's cancel it. He said, no, let's see who turns up. And anyway, when I went to the staff room at 1 o'clock, everybody was there. Why? One reason was they could not leave the building. The other was they were all absolutely confused at this terrible event, which had never, the likes of which had never struck America before. So they were in a state of utter confusion, and they were interested to see what a foreigner had to say. Well, I told them it's a terrible thing that has happened, and it's very important to find out who did it. But I said it's much more important to find out why it happened. Because if you know why it happened, you can prevent these things from happening again. And I think the audience was very responsive to that. And when you ask why it happened, then you begin to realize that international conflicts happen because of the vast amount of ignorance that prevails in the international community about the problems of other people. There is absolute ignorance of cultures other than one's own. One is born into a culture and lives boxed in within that culture for the rest of one's life. And 99.9% of the people of this world are in that situation because they are given no exposure whatsoever to the cultures of other people, the problems of other people, the grievances of other people, and naturally they see things only from their own point of view. Now, this is why I have said, and I have written extensively on this, that the way to have moderation in international affairs is to have education at every level. We must have peace education in schools, peace education at all levels, right up to the corridors of power, because in the corridors of power, these high concerns sometimes do not reach the ears of those who make the decisions. So it is vitally important that we have a regime of peace education, and I call upon this wonderful new movement that has just emerged to think in terms of being leaders in introducing peace education all over the world. Let there be an understanding of other people's cultures. Let there be an understanding of the basic principles of international law. And in fact, I myself have started a small peace education center on 3 principles: peace education, cross-cultural understanding, and using international law as an instrument of peace. There is a common belief that international law is an abstruse discipline far above the minds of the average citizen, and therefore that you should not tell the average citizen about international law. I think that international law is such a discipline based on common sense and sterling values that every school child understands it. And I myself have gone into schools in England, America, Australia, Sri Lanka, and spoken to 12 and 13-year-olds about international law, and that is the basic principles of international law. And I find them enormously responsive to this. Their eyes light up when they hear that in this world of cynicism, which they have been led to expect, there are indeed these higher principles that operate. So there must be universal respect for international law. And the International Court of Justice, on which I functioned for many years, does not have a single policeman or sheriff or constable to enforce its decrees. But over 90% of those decrees are obeyed. I'll give you one example. We had a case between Libya and Chad in regard to the southern boundary of Libya and the northern boundary of Chad. There were two parallel lines drawn by the two parties enclosing what was known as the Auzu Strip. Libya was the much more powerful party. It had marched its army into occupation of the Auzu Strip. And there it was when Chad came to the International Court. Well, we went into the matter in very great detail and finally held in favor of Chad. Now, we were, in other words, ordering the Libyan army, which was in occupation of the Auzu Strip, to get out of that Auzu Strip, although we did not have one single soldier to enforce our decree. And what happened? We gave our order. The parties arrived at an agreement. They met on the site. The flag of Chad was ceremonially hoisted, and the Libyan army formally withdrew. Now, is that not a victory for international law? That was obedience to international law out of respect for international law. And the media of the world reported not even half a line about this. But if Libya had violated the order of the court, that would have been blazing headlines. So we are led to believe that international law is not respected, whereas it is respected, and all our lives cannot be lived. Whether we post a letter or make a telephone call or travel overseas, international law is smoothly in operation in the background, but we don't realize this. So I have campaigned to make this better known to school children all over the world. And what is it based on? It's based upon the wisdom of all cultures. And here again, cross-cultural understanding is vital. It is important that children should know, of course, their own religion in very great depth, but they should know something of the basic teachings of the other religions. And I had the happy experience when I was in school that the principal every morning at assembly would read throughout the week on each day from one religion, from the scriptures of each religion. And we knew something of what the Quran said, what the Bhagavad Gita said, what the Dhammapada said, what the Bible said. And even as children of 12 or 13, we could have some discussion among ourselves. Now, if you have that stage of that level of education, then people will know that the central teachings of the religions are common to all of them. That is about human conduct, the peaceful resolution of disputes, the dignity of the human person, the unity of the human family, the avoidance of aggression, the protection of the environment, the care of future generations, the respect for treaties. All this you could go on enumerating 25 different basic principles of international law, which are the subject of common agreement among all the religions. So there is this wealth of wisdom lying behind us, which we are not utilizing. And international law can be reinforced tremendously by this. Now, when I went to the International Court, I found that the law administered in the International Court was largely a Eurocentric, Western-oriented body of law. Now, that was wrong. And I tried to open it up by showing the wisdom pertinent to international law of all the cultures of the world, Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, Confucianism, and so on. And I introduced a lot of those into the jurisprudence of the court. I'll give you two examples. In the nuclear weapons case, the question of the illegality of this terribly destructive weapon came up. And I referred to the Ramayana, where Hindu law relates this fact, that when there was the war between Rama of India and Ravana of Sri Lanka, Rama was told by his generals that there was a hyper-destructive weapon that was available, which would ravage the countryside of the enemy and decimate its population. But he was also told, but remember, before you use it, you must consult the sages of the law. The rulers then were probably more civilized than they are now. He consulted the sages of the law. And the sages of the law said, you shall not use this weapon because it goes beyond the purposes of war. The purpose of war is to defeat your enemy and live in peace with him thereafter, not to ravage his countryside and decimate his population. So Rama did not use that weapon. And Hindu law has got this wonderful notion encapsulated in its teachings that the ultimate sovereign of the world will not be a Chakravarti, it will not be a physical ruler, but, this beautiful phrase, the kingless authority of the law. That will be the ultimate ruler of the world. That is what we have to work towards. We do not want physical sovereigns or great empires. We want international law to be universally accepted. And we can make international law universally acceptable if we draw into it the civilizations and cultures and wisdom of all the world's population. So that is what we should try to do, and then we will have an instrument which is better able to function as the legal system of the world. Now, the weakness of modern international law is that when Grotius founded it, or is thought to have founded it in 1625, he was writing in the middle of the 30 Years' War. Now, the 30 Years' War, which raged from 1618 to 1648, was one of the bloodiest conflicts that Europe had seen up to that time, where Christians were killing Christians in the name of Christianity. Now, nothing can be more absurd than that, but 2/3 of the houses in certain parts of Germany were razed to the ground and populations wiped out in the 30 Years' War. So Grotius naturally thought this new discipline of international law, which I am working out, should be distanced from religion. He was quite right in thinking so in his time. But today we have no reason for thinking so. And we must draw in the wisdom of international law to strengthen and reinforce the principles of religions, to strengthen and reinforce the principles of international law, and making it a more acceptable instrument for being the ruler of the world. So that is what we want now. That's what we have got to work for. We have to work towards moderation. Moderation can only come through understanding. Understanding can only come through peace education. And peace education will open eyes to the wondrous wisdom there is in all the cultures of the world, which now lies unutilized, and in consequence of the ignorance of those vast cultures, there are so many disputes all over the world, which are causing so much havoc and so much misery to people all over the world. Let us be sensible. Let us open our minds to the wisdom of world cultures, the problems of other people, and we will soon have a solution to the problems of the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Judge Christopher, for that very eloquent delivery on the importance of peace education and international law. I now invite Professor Timo Kivimaki to make his address. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to start by thanking the organizers for a very interesting conference and congratulating Malaysia for initiating a very interesting initiative to world politics, and especially for sharing the definition of this initiative with the rest of the world. I think this is the only way to create global ownership to moderation. The only way is to allow the definition of what this interesting concept really means to everybody. I will talk about 4 different things. I'll first very quickly look at some conceptual issues, and then I will explain why a global paradigm of conflict resolution requires the acknowledgement of Southeast Asia's, ASEAN's, and East Asia's experiences of conflict prevention. And then I look at how they can be utilized for giving an input to a new global paradigm of conflict resolution. And finally, I will look into that paradigm and see whether it is moderate. The first issue that I think we need to recognize in our definition of what is moderate is that moderate is often seen as a concept in opposition to extremism. There is a problem with that. because of the fact that I think extremism is a concept that smuggles in an empirically unsustainable idea, namely the association between extreme commitment to religion and violence. I think empirically this doesn't hold water. And that's why we have to be careful so that we don't define moderation as something which is moderate commitment to religion rather than that it rules out strong commitment to religion. The other thing is something that the previous speaker also mentioned. Conflict prevention is not only conflict resolution. It is also creation of an environment where violent conflicts do not arise, so that they don't need to be resolved. At the same time, I would say, in this part of the world, I think conflict resolution is the main challenge. It hasn't been in the culture of East Asian peace or culture of ASEAN peace to resolve too many conflicts. I'll show you proof for that soon. But first of all, this is the reason why we need to take into account the experience of East Asia when we think of a new global paradigm. This is a graph that shows the number of conflict fatalities in East Asia. That is Southeast Asia and Northeast Asia. And as we see, after the 70s, conflict fatalities were reduced drastically. East Asia has been very successful. Let's look at it in terms of percentages. 95% of battle deaths, annual average battle deaths, disappeared after 1979. That didn't mean that conflicts disappeared. It's just battle deaths. I mean, 68% of conflicts disappeared as well, but the disappearance of battle deaths was more drastic, and especially interstate battle deaths were reduced. Very similar profile of peace among ASEAN countries. The ASEAN way of conflict prevention also reduced a lot of battle deaths and reduced interstate conflicts pretty much altogether. Here, conflict means conflict that kills at least 25 people. That's why it's 100%. One interesting thing, which I think for us Europeans is a surprising thing, is that the norm of non-interference, military non-interference, has been part of the explanations of East Asian and Southeast Asian peace. Military interference against a fellow ASEAN government has pretty much disappeared, and the same is true for East Asia. Now, this is understandable that for East Asia, the big conflicts were conflicts of interference. The reason why the war, why Vietnam War was so extensive, so big, was the fact that it was, I mean, there was a lot of interference both by Soviet Union, China, and the United States, and the same is true for Korean War. Of course, as Europeans, our problem was expensive ultra-nationalist governments. So therefore, our approach to non-interference is very different. But I think we need to acknowledge. The other thing is that ASEAN and East Asian Formula for Peace focuses on things that unite. On the one hand, this is very, very good. The main thing that unites is development. It's a common goal. You cannot have developments if you fight wars all the time. If you have revolutionary agenda, you can't have development. The downside of this is that if you don't focus on things that divide, you don't focus on disputes. This makes conflict resolution very difficult. And this, I think, is the main challenge in this region, and it's the challenge of moderation as well, that there has to be capacity, there has to be more capacity, there has to be capacity building in conflict resolution, in dispute resolution. The other thing is, the third thing in the ASEAN and East Asian formula is that it's a formula that attempts to create a situation which is dignified for all. Face saving is very typical. And here again, when we compare the belligerent East Asian period with the peaceful period, we realize that victories have disappeared. Wars do not end in victories anymore. This is because of the fact that there is an intention to find a dignified solution. Now, what can we learn from the East Asian experience that we can give to the global paradigm? One is this development orientation has addressed the needs, the basic needs. And that seems to be very important in the creation of a situation where violent conflicts don't even arise. The other thing is that this is something that I think East Asia and ASEAN needs to learn. There is a need for conflict resolution as well. There is a need for settling the disputes that already exist. Thirdly, it seems that even though development used to be the foundation of legitimacy of governments and stability of governments, today more and more democracy is also a requirement. I mean, I've done some regression analysis and tried to see associations between peacefulness and different conditions. Democracy is becoming more and more important as a precondition for stability. It's also important to recognize the usefulness of and acknowledge the usefulness of different regional contexts, including East Asian contexts. And here I refer to the non-interference issue, which seems to have been very important explanation for ASEAN peace and East Asian peace. Yesterday we talked about, Professor Thompson mentioned about the new development, the technological development of drone attacks and drones. I think it's true, of course, that drones are part of a technological development, but they are also part of a doctrinal development. They are part of a doctrine that doesn't respect non-interference, military non-interference. Now, ASEAN and East Asia hasn't seen drone attacks. Now, this is because of the fact that they would be too costly in this area because of the strength of the principle of military non-interference. At the same time, it seems that there is a need for some kind of interference because, when countries have difficulties with their own rebel groups, they cannot play football and be the referees at the same time, as Ambassador Wirjono has a habit of saying. They need help from others. They need interference, but they need maybe flexible engagement or I use the concept friendly interference because of the fact that it seems in my studies that the friendliness aspect is what is very important for influence to be successful. And then finally, I think what is an element that needs to be integrated into our paradigm of conflict resolution is that it seems that ASEAN success has been a success of small steps. It hasn't been success that is based on one fantastic strategy, either that some countries simply starts believing in the rule of law. If there is an idea that somebody thinks is being developed by simply pushing it forward oneself, one sees the problems of idealism, Neville Chamberlain type of idealism, where if you believe then it becomes true. It doesn't, unless others believe as well. And this is the formula of Southeast Asia that it moves in interaction. Everybody believes in the rule of law in international relations, and suddenly it does have, it does materialize. And finally, is this paradigm moderate? I think if we include the experiences of other regions, I think so far our paradigm of conflict resolution has been very West-centric. It has learned mostly from the experiences of Europe, actually. So including lessons of other countries, including moderation, I mean, as such, this way of sharing a concept is part of moderation, I think. Development orientation is moderation in a sense that it focuses on basic needs instead of being dogmatic about some revolutionary ideas. I think also development towards greater accountability and responsiveness is a way to build people-oriented moderation. Also, if we are, I mean, this is also already something that Dr. Surin Pitruan said previously. We have to find a middle way between very inflexible sovereignty thinking, where no criticism, even friendly criticism, is not allowed, and the kind of military type of interference. A new paradigm that takes into account the experiences of East Asia as well, seems to suggest a middle way here. So it's kind of moderate alternative. And then finally, the new paradigm could be a way to find a middle way between cynical realism of power politics and idealism, where we think that our idea simply materializes because we believe in it. The ASEAN experience of sharing ideas like moderation and jointly defining it, jointly owning it, seems to me that it is a very moderate way of approaching security and peace. I think that's all. I hope I have covered. I have run out of my business card, so I present my.
Thank you, Professor Timo Kivaki, for that very systematic breakdown of the conflict incidents in the region over the last 3 decades. And I've been personally impressed with the statistics and the hard work that you put in to make sense of the events. I now invite Professor Pangabalagan from the University of Philippines to make his address. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. Whenever I'm asked to speak on the place of law as a paradigm for conflict resolution, I am confronted with a classic argument, the classic counter-argument, that war is the vanishing point of law. And the other one is that before the guns of war, the laws fall silent. But that is exactly what I will do this morning. I offer the paradigm of the legal management of conflict. And I would like to trace it through the development of both human rights and humanitarian law. First, recall the preamble of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, whereas it is essential, if man is not to be compelled to have recourse as a last resort to rebellion against tyranny and oppression, that human rights should be protected by the rule of law. That posits a safety valve function that allows extreme positions to be expressed in non-violent ways. Notice, too, that it entails 2 shifts at one and the same legal moment. The first is to channel conflict into legal institutions that resolve them not on the basis of power, but on the basis of norms. That is, to shift away from politics and toward institutions, away from bargaining, away from negotiations, and toward dispute resolution on the basis of authoritative rules. The other shift is away from the purely domestic and into the international. That is to say, until then, how a state treated its own nationals was treated as a completely domestic matter. That was, in fact, the cornerstone of the post-World War II international legal order. And that is why, in fact, I myself have criticized many of the approaches in ASEAN to human rights. I have written, in fact, and I imagine there will be dissenting voices in this forum, that when it comes to human rights, the ASEAN way is to look the other way. But the point is that with the evolution of international human rights, we have recalibrated the line that separates the international, the domestic from the international. Let me proceed then to yet another development, that is from the standpoint of international humanitarian law. These conflicts, well, some conflicts do erupt into armed conflict, and at that moment we trigger off the application of another field of law, IHL. It offers a minimum level of protection to non-combatants. But how does it do that? It builds upon yet another conceptual distinction between jus ad bellum, which inquires into the causes of war, and toward the jus in bello, the rules that govern the conduct of hostilities. It is a shift away from the inquiry into the causes of war. And here I realize previous speakers have expressed a different position. It doesn't ask whose cause is legitimate, who is fighting the just war. It asks merely whether human dignity is being protected in the conduct of hostilities and protects civilians, non-combatants, injured soldiers, POWs from the use of military force. In doing so, it avoids getting entangled in the ideological and open-ended debates on who's right, who's wrong, who did it first. Rather, it focuses on the minimum standards to protect civilians while allowing the use of force, while conceding the use of force on legitimate military targets. There is another distinction. That is, again, it recalibrates the line between internal armed conflicts and international armed conflicts. But the end result, just like with the evolution of international human rights law, is to enable international humanitarian protection at a lower threshold, that is to say, before the conflict escalates into serious violence. In other words, whereas before the attitude was a conflict becomes international only when people really start killing one another, the evolution of these standards push toward a threshold which would say that perhaps before it gets that serious, we should step in. The next development is a shift away from state responsibility and toward individual criminal responsibility. At Nuremberg, the American chief prosecutor, Justice Jackson, said, these offenses, these crimes, are not committed by abstract entities like states. They are committed by individuals. And that is the point of the shift to individual criminal responsibility. As exemplified in the cases from the former Yugoslavia, the matter of state responsibility was heard before the ICJ, while the question of the criminal liability of individuals is being tried before the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia. By doing so, international tribunals do not pass judgment over states. They pass judgment only over the guilt or innocence of the accused individuals. It is indifferent to the political ideology of countries and of armies in conflict. It focuses simply on whether acts which were criminal in character had been committed, whichever side commits it. Finally, if you apply this to internal armed conflicts, it restores the legal symmetry between the contending parties to an armed conflict. Unlike traditional human rights cases, where only the state is bound while the rebels are not. Under human rights conventions, only the state is bound to respect human rights. Rebels are not party to these conventions, and indeed, not being states, are not even eligible to sign these conventions. In that sense, the situation is asymmetrical, and the application of this new paradigm restores the symmetry between the two armed groups. These developments are not alien to Asia. Previous speakers have spoken about the role of international courts in dispute resolution. Many Asian countries have been part of many of the tribunals that have been created to deal with the sad consequences of armed conflict. The Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal was created under the terms of surrender of Japan to the Allied forces. Today, ad hoc and hybrid international criminal tribunals have been formed in Asia. Asian states have also ratified the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. And as mentioned by previous speakers, several Southeast Asian countries have presented their disputes to the ICJ. Cambodia and Thailand and Preah Vihear, Malaysia and Singapore and Batu Putih, and Malaysia and Indonesia and Pulau Sipadan and Ligitan. This framework shifts conflict resolution from power to rights, from politics to institutions, and from the local to the international. It calls upon the power of the law as a brooding omnipresence twice over, as the communal check on private power, and as the national embodiment of international norms. I would like to close on this point. There is actually a fundamental problem with regard to the legal management of conflict that I have discussed. And that is, there is a current trend to embody law more deeply in domestic cultures. And I'll give a concrete example. If, for the conflict in Yugoslavia, we formed the ICTY and situated it at The Hague, well, for the terrible, for the tragedy in Cambodia under the Khmer Rouge, what we created was the extraordinary chambers and situated it in Phnom Penh. If you have followed the newspapers, it is a tribunal which has faced so many problems. But for me, the solution, the easy solution, would have been to situate it as well at The Hague. In other words, to create a tribunal totally disjunct from the community where the victims resided, perhaps detached from the drama, from the feelings of that national community, but render effective justice that would serve the campaign to end impunity. But therein, when we try to do that, we are faced with the current wave to situate these tribunals in local jurisdictions and thereby bring into those tribunals all the problems that already exist within those domestic jurisdictions. I am happy and I congratulate the Global Movement for Moderation for having initiated initiating this campaign. I propose that the campaign for moderation will find a natural home in the law, which calls for a sober second look at issues, and which aims to settle these conflicts, less on the question of who has the more lethal army, and more on the question of who has the more powerful moral arguments. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Pangablagan, for that scholastic rendition. We appreciate it very much. We now open the floor for Q&A, and may I remind you that the panelists here have respected the time constraint, so I would expect the same from the people too.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Stephen Leong from University Tunku Abdul Rahman, visiting ISIS Malaysia Fellow. I must say I've learned a lot from the very insightful presentations by our distinguished speakers. I was particularly struck by the justice from ICJ, who emphasized the great need in this day and age to promote peace studies. Because I find it very anachronistic, in fact, that countries at this time still have what is known as war college. It's about time that we switch to peace college for a change. But my question, my question to the distinguished speakers is, in seeking say, new paradigms for conflict resolution, apart from the big powers, superpowers, and the smaller countries, is there a role for the medium powers, middle powers, not only just individually, but as a group, and what are the prospects for their role? Thank you.
The lady in the middle. We'll take 3 questions first. We'll allow 3 persons to address the questions, and then we'll pass it on to the panelists.
Thank you. I direct this question to Professor Jayakumar.
Can you identify yourself and please stand
I
up?
beg your pardon. My name is Jamila Ibrahim. I'm from Sisters in Islam. I direct this question to Professor Jayakumar, and I refer to your point regarding intrastate conflicts and simmering domestic extremism. Moderation, like charity, begins at home. Yet we will be deluding ourselves if we don't acknowledge that there are fermenting and simmering extremism at home, using ethnic and religious differences as fuel. And I do take your point that to overcome the challenge of this is a joint effort between government and society. My question is, how do society, both as a group and as individual, to quote you, robustly speak out against this when there are threats of punitive legislative punishments waiting at the end for you? Thank you.
We'll have one more question, one from the other end. Can you raise your hand a little bit higher so that I can see you? Okay.
I'm Srikanth Menjoge from India, Strategic Foresight Group. I have questions to both Professor Jayakumar as well as Honorable Justice. Sir, revolutionary ideas and ideologies appear more exciting, whereas the moderate ideas and ideologies appear non-attractive, especially to the economically deprived sections of the societies. The question is, most of these extremist groups, because I have been a conflict resolution practitioner within India, and I have handled a lot of extremist groups personally. Most of these extremist groups, they begin with certain principle ideology, but subsequently become money-making machines. And then it becomes very difficult to handle them practically. Then secondly, media also plays a very vital role, but media publishes the violence more attractively than the way they portray the resolutions. How do we handle such situations? Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take 3 questions for now and allow the panelists to respond, and after they have done that, we'll return to the floor.
First of all, I want to thank the 3 participants who raised the questions, because I think inherent in the question is also very significant statements that they have made. I'll give some responses to each of the 3 questions. The first question by Mr. Stephen Leong spoke about the role, if any, of the small and medium powers as compared to the larger powers. I think it depends on the circumstances and the context of the dispute or the conflict or the potential conflict. So it's not easy to give a clear-cut answer, but if I may generalize without a specific context, sometimes the participation of a larger power may complicate the situation, because either the larger power has vested interests, or there's a perception that the larger power has vested interests, and therefore that may color the approach to the resolution of the dispute. So it may be more of an honest broker if a smaller country was seen to be offering its good officers in good faith. So I've given in my speech one very good example, that of a former president of Finland. So I think that's one example, but I'm sure if you search the recent history, you'll find many other examples, including offers by other countries in the recent troubles in Sri Lanka. Now, the second question, sorry, I did not get the name, I think Madam Jamila, about what I said about the total societal effort. I think the honest answer to that is that where people speak up to denounce mischievous, extremist views, it should be applauded rather than be denounced. They should be congratulated rather than punished. The third question from our colleague from India, I think inherent in this question is the point that you may have to look at the causes for some of the groups to take on an extreme position. So it goes back to the difficult debate of what are the root causes. If there are genuinely causes and factors which have led to a feeling of oppression and injustice, and therefore that has impelled some cause of conduct, then obviously that has to be looked into. But at the same time, we all know that much harm and violence has been done under the guise of promoting the interests of the oppressed. So we must be able to have a hard analytical look at what exactly is the factual situation. But I want to agree with you that the role of the media is crucial. Role of the media, I don't only mean the print, the traditional print media. I think the role of communication and dissemination, even in cyberspace, is extremely important, because we can sometimes have a situation of the tail wagging the dog, and the minority view, unchecked, uncorrected, unrebutted, over a period of time, gathers a momentum which masks the real sentiments and views of a majority. So the media must reflect the mainstream positions and the sentiments. And in all our societies, wherever we are, developed or developing countries, the mainstream position is always that of denouncing extremism. Thank you.
Well, the first question related to the role of middle powers, and I thought there was also a question, a relationship of that question to peace education. Now, of course, the middle powers are particularly well placed for being the proponents of this moderate path that we are advocating here. And the middle powers are neither the extremely powerful, who might be oppressing the smaller countries, or the extremely oppressed, who may be victims, but they are in the middle position, and therefore being especially able to emphasize the role of the middle path, the avoidance of force and so on, very much more strongly than the big powers would be able to do. But more importantly, I think, the middle powers have also been the home of the world's great cultures, the world's great cultures which teach the principles of peace. All of them have homes in the middle power area, and I think it is the fault of many of us, it's our own fault for not projecting to the rest of the world the wealth of wisdom that we can disseminate in regard to international law and so forth. And one thing that, for example, needs to be emphasized is that take even international law, centuries before Grotius and the others worked it out for the West. There were treatises on international law in the Islamic world. And the Islamic world were the first, they were the pioneers in working out the discipline of international law. Al-Shaybani and others wrote multi-volume treatises on this. But this is not known in the Western world. This is not, I think there is a great obligation on those of us in the middle powers to do something to propagate the position of the middle powers, to propagate the position that the world owes so much to all these cultural influences that stemmed from there. And we have been very silent about this, and therefore the rest of the world knows nothing about it. So we have got to conduct this campaign. But then we run into another problem, the problem of the power of the media. And the media today are very often in alliance with the powers that be. That is, whether it's the political powers or the economic powers, the media are often in a relationship with them. And I sometimes think that President Eisenhower's statement of the military-industrial complex could be widened to the military-industrial media complex, because all of them are very often together propagating a certain point of view. That is very often the point of view of the privileged and the powerful. And I gave you the case of Libya versus Chad. And there was a lot of comment at the time that the media made absolutely no fuss about this. They didn't even publicize the fact that international law had one of its wonderful victories in that case. Whereas if it had been the other way around, the media would have just highlighted it and people would have got the impression that international law is just ineffective. So there is a lot that we can do in this regard, but also this process of education involves the process of working out codes of ethics for these different groups of people who hold power in society. Now, I have played a role in trying to work out codes of ethics for nuclear scientists, codes of ethics for scientists in different areas of work, codes of ethics for judges, and I think codes of ethics for the media are very important, because very often the law cannot enforce certain norms of conduct, but codes of ethics or ethical principles can. So there should be a universal code of media ethics. Now we have just completed a universal code of judicial ethics. And likewise, there can be a universal code of media ethics, which by general acceptance throughout the world might impose some sort of constraint on the media. So there are lots of ideas that need consideration in this regard. Thank you.
I would like to pay attention to the distinction that Dr. Surin Pichuan presented in his speech earlier today between traditional power and kind of soft power, or power of ideas, power of reason. Because I think when it comes to conflict resolution, as was mentioned, the power of reason is what is needed. Sometimes the traditional power is just a problem, because with traditional power you have the suspicion of a hidden agenda. Also in paradigm development, I think it's important that the power is with ideas, power is with reason rather than with traditional power sources. This is an answer to the question of medium powers, and also answer related to the question of society's role and society's power, because society represents the power of reason, the power of ideas. In a way, the example that was mentioned, the peace process in Aceh, the mediator had no power. He was an individual and an NGO. So in that sense, conflict resolution as such was not